All right. And welcome everybody to the State of the Union. I am your host, Laura, and joined with me today is Mark Azad, CRO of Across AI. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself and Across, please?
Yes, thank you, Laura. Mark Azad, as she mentioned, I'm CRO here at Across AI. I've been a CRO and a seller for the better part of 20 years, primarily in database and infrastructure technology. I work for a company called Across AI. We've built reasoning graph technology with long-term memory. And one of the first use cases we are applying that to is within the go-to-market world, but we're also expanding into marketing and operations, and we'll talk more about that.
Yeah. So, Mark, when we talked earlier, one of the things that you had talked a lot about was how the reasoning graph is a lot more. This is the new standard. It's the new standard for how AI should operate. Tell us a little bit more about that and how that differentiates from RAG and how everybody has been talking about it thus far.
Yeah, certainly. So if you're familiar with RAG, database retrieval systems, they, 1 or 2 years ago, they were very impressive, right? They could provide quick research, quick analysis, but you quickly came across enterprise deployment capabilities that I guess limited the value and what they could provide. What we've seen in the market is that you need a much more robust underlying technology that specifically accounts for things like context, inferences, and memory. And so you can think of the reasoning graph, at least how we built it here at Across AI, as a system that not just takes the raw data and provides analysis on top of it, but it starts with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is you take a next best action that a human wants to apply. It could be a marketing use case, a sales use case, operations use case. And then we reverse engineer it down to the raw data. And we say, what are the different steps that a human took in order to achieve that next best actions? And it requires a bunch of inferences, we call them collections, that say, okay, take the raw data, give me the first pain points, give me the second pain points, and then mirror that. The real unlock and the value of the reasoning graph is that it's able to take a process, a defined process, and provide those next best actions at reliable scale that are highly accurate, that basically mirror what a human would do.
Yeah, and you use the important word memory, right? And we talked about how currently a lot of enterprise AI does not have that memory. And so tell us a little bit more about what memory is and how that supports workflows today.
Yeah, certainly. So it's really quite simple in the sense that, if you think about what a human does in any process or any workflow, we take in information from meetings or calls or lunches, dinners, etc. We synthesize that information, specifically applying what we knew about that company or that meeting or that entity. And then based on that, we take an action. And that action could vary from, as I said, a marketing use case, a sales use case, to operations use case. Up until now, agentic systems lacked true memory. They might be able to provide, as you pointed out earlier, in a RAG database, memory limited to a use case session or taking information and putting it into Claude or Gemini, and it gives you valuable insights into what happened with that specific siloed piece of information. When we talk about memory, we're talking about a reasoning graph that can take all of the historical information that occurred between a company and use a sales example, everything that has occurred in previous meetings, months and years of information, and understand that those details specifically within the context of a process that's predefined. So I'll give you an example. Let's just say take a sales use case. You might have a best practices that says, hey, for every interested customer that reaches a certain stage, we want to produce a proof of value document or a POC document. That's a technical criteria document that outlines what the customer is going to be evaluating you against, what are the technical speeds and feeds that it expects, and what are the outcomes. When we talk about memory and in the actual application of long-term memory, we're talking about a tool or a system that's able to take historical meetings, emails, call recorders, CRM data, all the things that a seller would use, and then based on the ingestion of that information, update a POV document, not just with what was said in one call, but multiple calls. And using a very specific example, applying that long term memory in the form of competitive landmines in a POV is a highlight. What it understands in one call against competitor A, the agent can apply memory, update a POV document with a specific landmine that we know trips up that competition, and then includes that in the document that the human reviews and then sends out. That's just one example, but there are many, many different examples of how the memory manifests itself.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, search and retrieval in the first version of Gen AI was looked really good. It sounded really good, and it was very conversational, very real, very realistic. But with reasoning graphs and memory, what it really is doing is protecting our institutional knowledge and making sure that that doesn't decay. Just like when an employee leaves, right? All of that institutional knowledge judgment goes out the window with that employee. This is sort of like helping us preserve those things.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the idea of being able to onboard a new user or educate employees with all of the historical information is exactly what that long-term memory provides. And you mentioned the RAG data systems a couple different times. The space is changing so rapidly, as you know better than I, Laura. A year or two ago, producing a RAG system for data retrieval would have been eye-opening, right? The speed with which it could search vast amounts of data and provide insights was incredible. As we touched on earlier, the real unlock we're searching for are when agents can take actions, agents that actually execute actions that we as humans would otherwise do. And that's where the long-term memory and reasoning graph capabilities really come in, not just for not losing historical context, as you pointed out, but can you produce actions that I, as a human, find highly reliable, maybe even better than I would have done on my own?
Yeah. So let's talk about buying AI and I think the last 2 years have been sort of an experimentation, and a lot of us have been, very open to experimentation. Let's say vibe buying is the term here, and that's going out the window a little bit because there's not a lot of pressure to actually show how what the real ROI is of an AI purchase. Tell us about how that transition from sort of, Gen AI V1 versus V2 here is changing and how we as buyers should be looking at it.
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple different thoughts on that. One is that the age old question of buyer beware has never been more true, right? There's so much snake oil out there in the AI space that the fundamental principles of the way buyers, technical buyers, should be evaluating vendors has not changed. And I'll give you some specific examples in our world. But before I do that, the steps that one must take that we've always provided with vendors has never been more true, meaning you're not just looking at technical features and functionality, but are you taking the time to clearly document tangible delineated ROI that can be realized over a 1, 2, 3 month period, and being able to objectively measure that and prove it has never been more important. So I just wanted to mention that because of all the claims that are being made in the market, it's really never been more important. Now, from our perspective, given the technology that we provide, there's two distinct buckets. There's major differences in your question between SMB mid-market enterprise buyers and the enterprise. Regardless of the differences, the way we think about it is that they need to always be thinking about the capabilities beyond today's use case. In other words, this may solve one pain point today, but things are changing so rapidly, as we've talked about, daily, weekly basis, things are coming out. So what I'm buying, is it extensible? Can I take this tool and apply it to use case number 2, number 3, number 4? Or is this a one trick pony? And that's a very fundamental question that needs to be universally applicable, regardless of whether you're a mid market or an enterprise.
And Mark, let me interrupt here because of what you said there. It just stirred my thought a little bit. How do you know what extensibility looks like if you can't even predict what those new use cases AI could do for you? What are some tips that you'd recommend buyers think about?
Well, I would say that you can predict what the use cases are in the sense that when you evaluate a technology, the vendor is going to say, "Look, we have this underlying technology, but let me show you the use case that we are applying it to." To the extent that you can document that in very clear detail, that starts to become the foundation of then where it could leap to. Again, it still needs to prove its value against use case number 1 across the lens that I mentioned a second ago, but it's not an unknown. This comes down to your ability to sift through a lot of the marketing and the sales and get down to the underlying facts that a tool can provide, whether it's a paid pilot or a POC. But once that is documented and it's proven, now you can very quickly see, okay, if that came to fruition, now I can extend it to the second use case. And using concrete examples, you might say, okay, I have a cross sell, upsell use case. I want to apply agentic technology, and can it meaningfully provide uplifts in my revenue with my existing stall base? If that's the case, then how can I apply it to, say, an executive briefing center where my executives want to have kind of an FBI briefing dossier that captures all of the information, all of the sentiments around my top 20% spenders. And I can give you more examples, but I would just say that while it is very, you have to be careful, as you said, to predict too far out, you can get a very clear line of sight into what is capable, measure it, and then expand.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me interrupt. You were going on to talk
Yeah.
about.
I was simply gonna say that, as it relates to kinda the buyer personas and the vibe buying, being dead, as you said, and an experimentation failing to scale, I would say that, for us, we bucket it into 2 groups. We are actively looking to engage with VPs of sales and CRO in the SMB mid-market, but in the enterprise space, we are talking to the VPs of AI, the brightest minds in AI that have been grappling with a lot of the deployment challenges and the enterprise deployment challenges for the better part of 3 years, even before, chat was released. And what I would say is that, the specific decision criteria, if you look at bucket 1, SMB mid-market, is basic questions. Of all the go-to-market challenges I have as a leader, can this solution solve the highest order business problems for me? That's number 1. Number 2 is, what is the time to value? Like, what are the deployment capabilities? What are the onboarding steps required? And will this be worth my time if these documented ROI metrics are achieved? And then how quickly can it be measured? And how objectively can it be measured? So those are the things that we think about when we're talking to the leadership in the SMB mid-market. Now, bear with me a second as I pivot to the enterprise, because this is where I think is the most meaningful change that we're seeing in the market. The specific decision criteria that we talk about with VPs of AI and enterprise are very different. They're saying, of course, the initial use case matters, but what they're looking at is, how broadly applicable is the underlying technology, and can it easily be configured to multiple use cases? What enterprise deployment capabilities does it have? Meaning, has it accounted for the technical challenges that I know as a VP of AI will inevitably pop up when I scale beyond 100 users? And I can give you examples if you're interested, but those are the core tenets that are popping up across the board. It doesn't matter if you're NVIDIA, Palo Alto, if you're LinkedIn, if you're Box, they are all wrestling with the same enterprise deployment capabilities that I can address if there's interest.
Yeah, so on the functional side, like on the SMB side outside of enterprise, you go to the functional leader and just talk about their functional business outcomes and whether or not we can help them there. And then
That's
like
right.
the enterprise side, you're talking to like VPs of AI, like infrastructure people that are thinking about how to deploy AI across the organization. And you were going to give some examples.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're correct in the summary you provided, and I'll give you very concrete examples of the things that keep those people up at night in the enterprise. It's one thing to have a RAG database retrieval system across, X number of users with one data source. The moment you start opening it up to cross-functional teams, multiple users attaching to multiple data sources, come across the very real issue of access level controls. What Laura should see based on her database access level controls might be different than Mark, but yet we're working on the same project. Same thing can apply to leadership. So, who should see what? And when the agent is offering up something, that is a non trivial task that all of these VPs of AI are dealing with.
Yes.
Compounding knowledge that spans weeks and months. So, does it incorporate its understanding of the past in a useful and reliable way? This is where the memory comes into play. Data size and complexity. Does it have an explosion in file counts? Are we dealing with duplication all over the place? Is my ultimately that underlying data exploding in unuseful ways that might be prohibitive? And then contradictory data, like does it handle the flood of information that the agents are accessing and producing, and how does it handle override logic? These are the things that the VPs of AI at NVIDIA and Palo Alto are dealing with, and they're looking for underlying technology that has already addressed that or is building it in meaningful, thoughtful ways.
Yeah, and these are some like very sophisticated buyers that I'm hearing about, right? Like they're very educated and they know what's up. How do you think selling has evolved when we are interacting with such sophisticated buyers?
So, as a lifelong technologist, I actually don't think it has evolved that much. Meaning, back to the original comment that I mentioned to your question, buyer beware has never been more true.
Mm,
Technical buyers 20 years ago, when I was working at Oracle or at Couchbase, they always had the same approach. I believe what you're saying, but I need to verify it in a POC. You're correct. The VPs of AI at NVIDIA and Cisco and Box and LinkedIn, these are the sharpest, brightest minds of AI. They are cutting edge. They know exactly what the market offers. It comes down to age-old best practices in a technical criteria, in a technical bake-off, clear, very delineated technical features that need to be addressed, and then the associated business outcomes. These people are no different, and if anything, they are more acutely aware of the pains that they've been through the last couple of years, looking at
yes.
different vendors, and that process needs to be in lockstep with the vendor without question.
And when you're implementing or you're buying something like this for the enterprise, where you're thinking about things like access control and things that are like sort of fundamental to how an organization runs, what are some ways that we build the ROI for the CFO? How do we like even think about quantifying this?
Yeah. I'll give you an example in sales, and there's other examples that we are being pulled into specifically in marketing and in post sale. But let's just use sales as an example. If you can go to any leader in any enterprise and say, I can lift up your revenue by 5%, or I can increase your deal velocity by 10% with the same headcount without hiring new people, you have their attention, but it needs to be proven. So whether it's in the SMB, mid market, or enterprise, what we're seeing are POCs that center around exactly that, leveraging agentic technology, in our case with underlying reasoning graph and long-term memory, and being able to automate in large part what humans would otherwise take hours or days to do. It's done in a fraction of a minute, or it's done in a handful of minutes, freeing those people up to go chase more deals or go basically task them with higher order value processes that agents quite can't do yet, or rely upon human to human interaction. So back to your core question, it really comes down to, in the case of sales, take a 90-day period pre-deployment and walk me through the metrics that your team with X number of sellers can accomplish. Let me compare that against the next 90 days where the technology is installed, and you should be able to show very objective measurements across deal velocity, revenue uptick, et cetera. That's where we're seeing customers saying, wow, this is objective. I can take this to leadership. The tool has paid for itself in a matter of weeks.
Yeah. And would you say that that's also the same approach regardless of whether you're going to a functional unit versus, for example, a VP of AI? Like how did they assess ROI?
It's a great question. So the ROI that I mentioned a second ago with the VPs of business is very objective in the manner that I just said. However, when you're talking to the VPs of AI, these people are so advanced that they are less looking at ROI per se, but they're looking about the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is what is the extensibility and configurability of the platform? Because remind you, these are stakeholders who have 10 BUs they have to support. And
Yes.
they know based on their interactions that each of those different BUs has very different workflows, very different requirements. So if you're selling me a tool that's purpose built for use case one, but has trouble going beyond that, they're thinking along those lines. But if it's configurable and it's easily configurable to different use cases that span what you initially showed me, that's the lens with which they're looking at it, along with the things that I mentioned before: access level control, duplication, the inherent logic that the system provides. That's the lens. There is no ROI to cut to the chase, Lauren, on that, but
Yeah.
they're looking about it in breadth of functionality, specifically within enterprise challenges.
Okay. Okay. Very cool. Awesome. Okay. So if we are an enterprise or an organization that already has, adopted AI and we're not in this like Gen 2 version of it, V2 version of it. What do you think are some ways that an organization can very easily shift, or maybe it's a step by step approach to, moving from RAG to reasoning graphs?
Well, I would say that it depends on the definition of a company being quote unquote AI adopted. And what we found candidly is that a lot of the quote unquote AI that people are using are what I'll just say insights driven. So,
Mm,
using, and I won't name technologies, but using different technologies from big vendors and small vendors alike, they are able to provide real value in siloed ways, synthesizing calls or synthesizing CRM or email and providing you information. I think that's a very it's a good start. But when you say like, how do we take that step if we're already there to this, it really goes back to what we talked about: is let's put the fluff aside and give me a workflow that provides value to your company. Like, let's not take a use case or a process that's off to the side. If unlocked, if automated, would this be the number one or number two or number three priority for you? And let us prove over a 60, 90-day period that the vast majority of that can be not only automated, but
yes.
specifically mirrored with the next best actions that your top 1% employees would take. And I can explain more about that. So it's not just automation, but it's really mirroring the behavior that leadership wants to see across their workforce.
Right. Right. Okay, awesome. Mark, that was very helpful and insightful. Let's learn a little bit more about you. You called yourself a lifelong technologist, and you've been CRO for a number of different companies, AI and non AI companies, but still technology. What's been most interesting for you, I think, in the shift?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in the majority of my career selling, as you said, database technologies, infrastructure, and being a CRO, a lot of the sales and kind of a lot of the approach I've taken has been around technologies that have already existed. So, a database technology or an analytics technology, et cetera. Much like we've seen with other technical waves, other technical revolutions, the biggest shift that I've seen goes back to what a lot of the Deloitte, the Accentures, the PwCs of the world specialize in, and that's change management. You
Mm,
mentioned, a second ago, hey, how would you recommend to a company that's already had AI VI1 go to V2? It is a fundamental change in the way people think. It's one thing for a company to get on a call with us and say, yes, we're interested in applying agentic technology. But when you really get into the weeds with them, we're talking about changing the way they think and changing the way they allocate resources. And so one of the biggest things that I've observed is there's a very clear line of delineation between companies that say they want to and companies that are functionally, organizationally ready to make the changes, allocation of resources, that is necessary to adopt a lot of what we've talked about today. That's nothing new, but it's never been more true.
yeah, and as far as change management goes, how are you seeing that change management within your internal sales teams? Like, have there been things that you're doing differently now that you're selling in such a fast paced environment with your teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm a little long in the tooth as a seller, right? And so for the longest time, I've operated out of spreadsheets, I've operated out of to-do lists on paper. And I'll be honest, when we first released our own tool, dog food, I didn't use it as much as I probably should have. And that's
Yeah.
because of the 20 years of, having a processy and a method that works for me. And so slowly over time, realizing that the more I give the agentic technology information and feed it, the better the outcomes are going to be for me and the faster I'm going to be. And so today I am highly, highly reliant upon every call that I take, every sales cycle, I go through my tool because it has made me exponentially faster and
Mm,
exponentially more productive. But that doesn't happen overnight. And so the way I would answer that is, the change management concept that we talked about, at least within the sales ecosystem, takes time for sellers who have been doing it for a long time. If you're
mm.
earlier in your career and you're AI native, perhaps, that doesn't apply. They're ready to go. This is all they know. And so it's very exciting to kind of work with different layers of experience in the enterprises and the SMB mid market because you come across a wide variety.
And has there been something different about how you are now assessing candidates because of this?
That is a great question. The truth is that we haven't yet begun to scale, but that's going to change here in the subsequent months. But I have ideas on the ways that I'm going to assess them. And lifelong practices of using actual projects or actual homework have never been more applicable. Much like we talked about buyer beware, having, very defined POV use cases, having very defined outcomes. The same is true here where you want to be able to give candidates very easy tech projects in the form of the interview process and say, go ahead and apply AI to this workflow and let me see what you produce. And you're going to get very insightful results as a result of using that.
Okay. Well, to all listeners who are looking for a job in sales, they'll come find you
Yes.
in a little bit. Then,
Yeah.
cool, Mark. Thank you so much for the conversation. Anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up here?
No, I appreciate it. It's a very exciting, fast changing time, and I'm pleasure to be on your podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
to all our listeners, if you liked it, please drop us a note, like us, and otherwise, until then, we'll see you next time.